Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, Happy New Year. Thank you for coming on today.
Happy New Year.
Well, let's start with Wall Street, where we saw a nice gain on the first day of the new year. The Dow and the S&P at new highs. Shares of Tesla in particular were up 13% after it reported record high vehicle deliveries. Apple shares up too, making it the U.S.'s first $3 trillion company. Gains too for some airline companies. What's the story as we start a new year in the global markets?
Yes, the Wall Street kicked off 2022 on a very strong note. Both S&P and Dow Jones closed at a record high after rising more than 0.6%, while the Nasdaq also jumped 1.2%. Investor remains quite optimistic about the economic growth rate. Of course, continue to watch out for the spread of Omicron COVID variant. But all in all, a lot of people are expecting the recovery should happen as the long-term interest rate of 10-year government bond rate has risen to 1.6% plus. In terms of the corporate side, Tesla have soared 13% after the company announced its delivery of 308,600 vehicles in fourth quarter, which is beating the estimation of 263,000 vehicles. Also, as the interest rates have risen, Wells Fargo and other banking sector stocks have risen quite sharply. The Wells Fargo was up more than 5% as the Barclays upgrade the bank to overweight from the equal weight. All in all, it seems that both sides of the growth stock and the value stock seems to be doing well despite the higher interest rate environment. As you know, a lot of these large cap companies, including Apple, which reached the $3 trillion market capitalizations, they are showing very strong cash flow. They have probably very little debt, and therefore rising interest rate environment doesn't negatively affect them. And they seem to show continuous growth in terms of the sales as well as the cash flows. So all in all, we think that U.S. market have kicked off quite strongly. That kind of trend should continue in the future, at least until the first quarter the fourth quarter of last year numbers comes out, which starts on the 14th of this month till probably towards the end of the next month. So as these earnings are coming out, we think the market is probably in position for further rise. And U.S. dollar seems to be fairly stable at 96. So foreign investors' interest towards the dollar-denominated assets seems to continue to be very strong.
Well, the Korean market today was pretty volatile. Mid-morning, a significant decline on the Kospi, but closing just about flat, a slight gain. Shares of LG Chem up more than 4%, though, a gain for some other affiliates, including LG Electronics. What happened today in the domestic market?
Yes, pretty much the market was very volatile today, and it closed at very much of a flat. It was up by 0.02%. And also the Kosdaq was down by 0.6% or so. Clearly, there is a uncertainty regarding what's happening to the Korean won. We have seen Korean won depreciating quite sharply. Right now, it has reached to 11.95. So the uncertainty is in regards to the currency that results into foreign investors being very cautious about what to do in terms of the investment. But if you look at the overall net purchases, we did see slightly net buying by the foreign investors, but the major net buyer is the retail investors, which they purchased 645 billion won worth of equity today. Foreign investors slightly up by 90.8 billion, and institutions continues to be net seller of the Korean market. As for the Kosdaq, continuation of the retail investors net purchase as much as 530 billion, while the foreign investors selling 230, institutional selling about 280. So there's continuation of uncertainties. Now, in terms of the economic pictures, we did see the trade deficit happening, but of course, continuation of very strong export numbers is coming through. Also, if you look at the overall trend of individual sectors, we did see that the market seems to be very volatile. Despite the semiconductor industry were very strong in U.S., the SOX ETFs and the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index were up quite strongly, but the market was fairly flat with Samsung Electronics up by only 0.13%, and Hynix is flat after declining by somewhat yesterday. So it seems that people are still confused. Of course, we do think that the Korean market will be in good positions to rise in the future on the basis of very strong export numbers as well as a sustainable growth rate of GDP. But nevertheless, for the time being, uncertainty in the currency movement is still happening, and therefore market seems to be volatile as foreigners are not coming back aggressively to buy the Korean equities.
Well, meanwhile, oil prices are continuing to rise from their recent low, up today to just over $76 a barrel for West Texas Intermediate. Brent futures for March up 1.5%. OPEC reportedly sees pretty steady demand this year. What do you see happening with oil prices?
Yes, I think that both sides of demand and supply continues to support the oil price to further rise in the future. But given the fact that they're in good position to increase the supply, we don't think that the oil price will hit above $80 again. We think that the range bound should continue to happen, and currently right now WTI oil price is at $76. Now we're waiting for the OPEC Plus meetings on Tuesday. It's most likely that they will be planning to add output. So output hike is expected while the economy is recovering. All in all, we do see that inventory levels are dropping and the demand seems to be quite reasonably strong. If we look at on a long-term basis, we do think that the Saudi Arabia and other OPEC Plus countries will be adding some more further supplies, and therefore we're not going to see energy-driven inflation to be that much. Of course, it did affect quite aggressively towards the end of last year. But going into this year, we think that the energy price should be fairly reasonably sustained while the oil price remains at where it is, which is about $76 per barrel.
And finally, Mr. Yu, the governor of the Bank of Korea, Lee Ju-yeol, said in his New Year's briefing that there'll be a need for thorough risk management in 2022. He sees also convergence with digital technology continuing in the financial industry, something he welcomes. Tell us about his New Year's outlook and your own.
Yes, at the New Year's event, South Korea Central Bank Chief Lee Ju-yeol have said that there are urging the local financial institutions to brace for the possibility of a growing credit risk from heavily indebted household and self-employed companies. As you know, the consumer debt level of Korea is well above 100%. And as you know, the interest rate hike is happening as the BOK have raised interest rate twice last year and expected to raise another 2 times this year. So all that means the higher interest rate with the higher debt to GDP ratio of consumer, that clearly creates a bit of a problem, given the fact that higher interest rate would result into lower consumption. So clearly consumption is a bit of a concern as the domestic debt level remains to be very high. But of course, we think that the overall export numbers and the global economic sentiment or the environment should be fairly positive for Korea, and we think the export growth rate should continue to remain at 2-digit growth rate, and that means that it is a good, it will have good room for domestic consumption to pick up with the higher export effect. So I guess it was trickle down effect. Going into the future, the chairman, the central bank chief, have said that digital advancement is very important. The digital technology merging with that will be very important for Korea's futures. Of course, we've been seeing the various type of the cryptocurrency effect and ample applied liquidity affecting these type of new currencies to be quite strong in terms of the share price movement. Right now, as interest rate is expected to be increased by U.S., which means that it affects the liquidity to be negative, and that results into Bitcoin prices and the cryptocurrency prices to fall. But I guess going into the future, applying this digital innovation will be very important for the future of the developing market. Korean won should be much more keen to follow the U.S. dollar movement, but nevertheless, still it is an emerging market, and therefore it gets negatively affected when the dollar strengthened. So that seems to be the current concern. But as you know, Korea is a highly technology-oriented country, and therefore, in terms of digital innovation, we do expect that to be growing quite rapidly in the future.
All right, Mr. Yu, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.